Okay, thank you for joining me again. This is going to be another interesting day's Gemara, I hope, as this whole beginning of a Perek of Hecholil is, which is really wonderfully descriptive of the events around the Simchat Beit HaShoeva during the Beis HaMikdash, the ceremony, the libation ceremony, and all the rejoicing, the colorful spectacle that took place in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. Last week, just to say where we were last week, although we're going to make a new start this week, but last week, after describing the ceremony of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, and how someone who hadn't observed and witnessed such a ceremony had never really seen a beautiful event and a joyful event, the Gemara went on to say someone who hasn't seen the Beis HaMikdash, the building of the Beis HaMikdash in its full glory, has never seen a beautiful building before. And that brought the Gemara into a little bit of a tangent. It went on to describe this wondrous architectural structure, which was the shul in Alexandria, which was so large that it needed gaboim to use almost semaphore to express to the tzibah exactly which part of the service they were on, when to say Amen. What a beautiful building it was, all the wondrous chairs, the way in which the different professions sat separately. And following that, the Gemara went on to say that this community in Alexandria was unfortunately wiped out. The Gemara said this was due to Alexander the Great, but subsequent study and other versions show that it was a Roman destruction in Alexandria around the year 115 or so of the Common Era, and was a destruction of a major Jewish community, which included the leveling of the wondrous shul in Alexandria. The Gemara went on to say, why was it that the Alexandrian community was so completely wiped out in that terrible event, in the massacre and the destruction of that time, and attributed it to the fact that Alexandrian Jurians specifically had violated this law about not returning to Egypt, quoting the posuk that says you shouldn't return again into Egypt, which is actually a command which is given in the Torah to the king, that he shouldn't send people down in order to get horses. But it's understood that somehow there's a little bit of a chayrim on Mitzrayim, and the jury that set up itself in such splendor in Alexandria violated this over a period of centuries, setting up their home, not just their home, but their New Jerusalem in Alexandria in large numbers, and they violated this command, and as a result they were punished, and that community was wiped out. And towards the end of the last year, I actually went through a number of opinions that justified famous Gedolim, sages living in Alexandria, and not just in Alexandria, in Egypt in general, in Cairo, over a period of many centuries, even in more modern times. If there is such a cherem against living in Egypt, what was the Rambam doing as being the doctor to the caliph in Cairo and leading a Jewish community there? And it wasn't just him, there was the Radvaz, there were other very major figures that set up home, great rabbinic figures in Egypt, and surely they're also violating. And so we discussed that, whether in fact they were really violating, whether there were some let-offs for them, whether it depends upon when this habitation takes place, the fact that today Egypt isn't Egypt anymore. Maybe Egypt as far as the map is concerned, but the population is different, the genetic mix is different, they're not necessarily ancestors of the Egyptians, and all sorts of other excuses for life in Egypt. And that was the end of last week's share. So we went on a little bit of a journey from the Beis HaMikdash right down, we went down into Mitzrayim. We're back again now to talk about the Simchas Beis HaShoeva in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, with a great spectacle there, music, song, dancing with flames, and the whole lit up spectacle that was such a great event. And in the Mishnah, which we did a few weeks ago, probably quite a few weeks ago, that went through some of the material on the events, the description of the event itself on each day of Sukkot, there was a phrase which we're now going to start. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the bottom of 51b, Nun Aleph Omid Base. The second word here after the dot is B'motzei Yontov. Now, this is a reference to words in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, B'motzei Yontov Harishon Shel Chag, on the Motzei Yontov for the first day of Chag. In other words, at the end of the first day of Chag, when it was nighttime and Chol HaMoed was coming in, if you like, because there's only one day of Yontov, of course. Yordu lezras noshim, etc. Mitaknim shom tikun godol. The Mishnah said, it's not in the Gemara, I'm just quoting you now, but that's the etc. which the Gemara is referring to, which was in the Mishnah, that they made a tikun godol. The Beis HaMikdash builders poured in with their ladders and their hammers and their nails and their drills, and they constructed an edifice to ready the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash for this great spectacle of the celebration of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. It wasn't just a question of moving in, you actually had to ready it. And what did they do? They made this Tikkun Gadol. Tikkun Gadol means some great construction, but the Mishnah didn't tell us what that construction was, which is highly inconvenient. So the Gemara now questions this, and this is where we start, really. The Gemara says, "My tikkun gadol?" Question mark, if you like. What was this great construction or this great improvement that they made on the Motzei Chag? So Omer Rabbi Elazar explained, it was the following: Ka'osa sheshaninu. It was that which we learnt, or we are told about in a Mishnah in Midot. Midot is one of the Mishnahs that discuss the architectural structure of the Beis HaMikdash, its rules, the courtyards, its measurements, and so forth. So the Mishnah there says that the Azora of the Ezras Noshim, the courtyard, which was called Ezras Noshim, where this spectacle took place, this enclosure, Chalaka Hoisa Barishona, and I showed you this picture from one of the temple books, was smooth to start off with, and then Vahikifuhu Gezustra, they made beams emerging from the walls of this Azora. And on those projecting beams, they built balconies. And those balconies were the galleries from which the women used to sit high above the floor of the Azora and gaze down. So if I just share my screen with you at the moment, I don't actually have any photographs, which is a little bit of a shame. You can look through Google and you won't get any photographs. But if you remember, I did show you, it's not clear in the picture that I showed you, maybe because they don't want to confuse you. Well, I mean, here you see again the Beis HaMikdash. That's the great big Heichal. This area here was the Ezras Nashim. And this Ezras Nashim was where the events took place. And the Gemara is saying that from this level, the projecting bulk ceilings over here, or the colonnades, beams came out and balconies were built. And those balconies were like a women's gallery, just like we have in Beit Knesset HaNasi, that looked over the events that were to take place below. And if we just go back to see this wonderful picture over here, I'm not sure whether we're actually seeing women. I'm not sure women should have been on top. I think there should have been projections over here and balconies on top. You can see the events taking place below. This is again is the Ezrat Nashim, where the spectacle takes place. But they would have been balconies all the way around the three sides, and there would have been hundreds of women on top, and they would have been looking down. Just bring this down. And that is the Tikkun Gadol. This was the great structure that they prepared. Now it's interesting, if you follow the Gemara, it is clear that the balconies were not in place the whole year round. they were placed there. I'm just going to quit sharing for a moment. They were placed there for the spectacles of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. They would have been somehow supporting beams projecting, and then they would have built balconies on that just for the occasion, and they would have dismantled those balconies. So they were not there all the time. It's a little bit like people who have parts of their outside wall in their gardens readied in order to fit sukkah fencing into, right? And then all you have to do drill into those wooden beams into the fencing and you set up your sukkah. So it was a question of setting it up and then dismantling later on. And the women would look down. And this was the forerunner of a women's gallery. And we'll talk about this in much greater detail in a moment. In other words, the mechitza around the women's area in a Beit Knesset, which we have today. This is the archetypal form of women's gallery, but only for this occasion in the Beis HaMikdash. They didn't generally daven up there. It was for the purpose of looking down at the events in the Ezrat Nashim. So now the Gemara goes to bring a brisa that is slightly more descriptive of the events that led up to the institution of this setting up this structure. It wasn't always like that, says the Gemara. So the Gemara brings the following brisa, which again is an old Tanaitic statement. Tana Rabbanon, Borishona, at first, which means at the beginning, which could mean centuries before this structure had been put in place in the Beis HaMikdash, Hayunoshim mibifnim. The women were allowed to be inside. Oh dear, what's going on? Is there going to be mixing of the genders? The women were actually in the Ezras Noshim, and I'm talking about for the purposes of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. They were there a lot of the time if it wasn't a Simchas Beis HaShoeva, but during a Beis HaShoeva, when the men were doing all the wriggling around and dancing with flaming torches, the women were inside. And then the Brisa says, and I don't really understand this very well, the Anoshim mebechutz, and the men were outside. They were in the square of Har HaBayis. They were actually not in the Beis HaMikdash compound at all. They were outside, and maybe they did their dancing outside rather than inside. And the women were looking through the gates, maybe outward. I find this a rather strange setup, but that's what the Brisa says. And this led to levity and if you like, mixing between the men and women, chas v'shalom, so that this was something that wasn't done really and shouldn't have been done. And the management of the Beis HaMikdash were displeased about this mixing of the sexes. So hiskinu, they then instituted a change. They reversed it. They said, let the men do all the dancing inside in the Ezras Noshim, and the women will not have admission, but they'll be outside. They will be listening and maybe seeing some of the flaming effects from the Har HaBayis area outside, not actually in the compound of the Beis HaMikdash at all. And the men will be inside. However, that didn't sort things out, says the Brisa. There was still mixing and mingling. So how was there mixing and mingling? Well, maybe when the women went into the Beis HaMikdash, they used to perhaps have a bit of a chitter-chatter with the men who were, when the men went into the Beis HaMikdash, into the Ezras Noshim on this basis, and the women were outside on the Har HaBayis. On their way in, they would have had another mingling event. There would have been a bit of a B'nai Akiva, meeting between the genders, which really wasn't something that was approved of. So that was also unacceptable. Having seen this, they finally reached the realization that they had to separate them, and they separated them vertically, so that the women, therefore the women, they made this binyan, these balconies at a higher level, gazing down onto the men. So there was no way that they could shake hands or they could chitter-chatter because one was 20 feet above the other. So the two genders would not mix. Now, let me just start to share again. This seemingly fairly cute description of the history on how the genders were separated is something that was very, very significant and led to a very big machlokus in the mid-1900s. And it was a machlokus in relation to what constitutes a halachic mechitza for to separate the men and women at the time of tefillah in a Beis HaKnesses. Seeing that what we have here in the Gemara describes the institution in the Beis HaMikdash to separate the genders. This was used as, if you like, the basis for setting the terms for mechitzas in a Beit HaKnesset, because there seems to be a parallel. You don't want kalus rosh, you don't want intermingling either of the genders in a shul. So let's look at the Beis HaMikdash Tikkun Gadol as a model. Well, if you take that model, it would seem that the optimal form of women's gallery is a women suspended above the men, as we have, for example, in Beit Knesset Hanossi in all big shuls. Of course, in many shuls, it's not like that at all. Women are at the same level. It's just there's a mechitza behind. But it would seem, point A, it would seem that the optimal form of separation is one where there's a vertical division between the men and the women. So even though that's the case, it has been accepted. It isn't always possible to build a vertical division. Depends on what kind of building you're moving into. So if there's a horizontal division and you need a mechitza, you need some fencing to separate the two genders, what constitutes kosher fencing, halachically kosher fencing, for the purposes of separating men and women? And on this, there was a major machlokus. And that major machlokus is partly due to two versions you find in the Rambam, where the Rambam seems to say one thing in one place and something else in another place. So let's have a look at the words of the Rambam over here. So first of all, this is the Rambam, this first section here is the Rambam in his Pirush HaMishnah. Now the Rambam, as is well known, wrote two great works. In fact, he wrote many great works, but two of his major halachic great works, one of them was his Pirush on the Mishnah. He wrote a commentary on all the Mishnahs, in which he took an overview of the Mishnah and added interesting comments, sometimes taking issue with many other commentators. That's the commentary alongside the Mishnah. He also wrote, of course, his Yad HaChazokah, his Mishnah Torah, which is his magnum opus of many volumes, in which all the halachic content of Shas, Bavli, and Yerushalmi is contracted and beautifully ordered and rearranged in wonderful Hebrew. And that's the Mishnah Torah, which is not a commentary on the Mishnah or on the Gemara, but is essentially a distillation of the conclusions of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So let's first of all see what he writes on the Pirush HaMishnah. This is where he's discussing the Mishnah that we have about this great tikkun that was made, this great structure for women. So here he writes, Tikkun Gadol, Rotzaleo Gadol HaToeles. The Tikkun Gadol means something of great value was made. For who? Ki ha'am ha'yu v'taklim mokom le'anoshim u'mokom le'noshim. That in the Beis HaMikdash, they made a separation between the places where the men and the women would be, at least for this, in this occasion, because he's referring to the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. U'mokom ha'noshim l'ma'ala mi'mokom ha'noshim. The Mokom Anoshim was above that of the Mokom Anoshim. The two genders were separated vertically. Why? What was the reason for this mechitza? So now here's key. Kidei shelo yistaklu hanoshim b'noshim. In order that the men should not gaze at the women. So it seems to be something to do with looking up or looking at, right? You don't want men looking at the women and seeing which one, he'd like to take out for a date later on. So in order to prevent this gazing, the view of the women from the men, by the way, it doesn't say there's a problem with women looking at men. There's a problem with men looking at women. Seems to be very much a fact halachically. So in order to prevent the men looking at the women, they made this separate gallery. Now let's look and see what his version is in his Mishnah Torah, where he's producing his halachic distillation. So he says here, this is interesting in itself. Even though all the Yomim Tovim, it's a mitzvah to be happy, the Chag HaSukkos, during Chag HaSukkos, there was a very almost extra level of joy and simcha built into the occasion. Shenema, in the Beis HaMikdash, it says, "Usamachtem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yomim." You shall rejoice before Hashem your God 7 days. And it's understood that lifnei Hashem Elokeichem is referring to the Beis HaMikdash. So in the Beis HaMikdash, there's a great requirement for simcha during the days of Sukkot, and it's the Simchas Beis HaShoeva that we're referring to. The Ketzad HaYosin, what were they doing there? Erev Yom Tov Rishon, he actually says Erev Yom Tov Rishon, they were already working Erev Yom Tov, in order that everything would be ready. Ha'imetaknim ba'mikdash, mokam lanoshim milmala, or la'anoshim milmata. They made a separate place for the men and for the women to be. Now listen to this. Kadesha lo yisarvu elu im elu. In order that the two genders should not mingle physically with each other. Now these are two different reasons given for a mechitza. Up here, it's to prevent the men looking at the women. And over here, it's to prevent the men physically mingling with the women, shaking hands, sitting together, and mixing about physically. Now, this is actually sounds as though it may be quite a trivial, or maybe one's just an enhancement of the other. But depending upon what you say is the main thrust of a mechitza to separate men and women, if you say that the first Rambam opinion is there, then a man shouldn't really gaze at a woman. Any mechitza, for example, should then be opaque. If you have a mechitza, let's say you're on the same level even, and your mechitza is made of glass, well, it could be 12 feet high, and there's no mingling. But if it's possible for the men to see the women, it would be illegal. It would be halachically invalid, because the object of a mechitza, according to this first version of the Rambam, is to prevent the viewing. A men shouldn't view the women because it's a lack of tzniut of some sort. However, if you take the second version, which is that they shouldn't physically mingle, ironically, it would be possible to build a mechitza out of glass, which was entirely transparent, and you can wave at your wife through the barrier, and she could wave back at you, and you'd all see each other all the time, so long as it was high enough to stop people climbing over. That way you're preventing a mingling of the sexes. That's all you need to do. And strangely enough, the question of which of these is the important motivation behind a mechitza was the background to the machlokas between Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Satmar Rav. We're going back to the 1950s and 1960s, particularly important at the time when conservative shuls were building in America, perhaps putting aside some of their mechitzot or building very, very low mechitzot in order not to look as though they were imposing too much of a barrier between the men and the women. Rav Moshe Feinstein was very makel. He was happy to follow the opinion of Kedei Shelo Yisarvu Elu Melu, the second view of the Rambam over here, that the purpose of a mechitza is simply that the two genders don't physically intermingle. And on that basis, I think he allowed a mechitza that was 1.5 meters high, which is maybe 5 feet. That's what you often hear, 5 feet high. That's not a very high mechitza at all, especially when people are, men are very often 6 foot tall. And he allowed that. Why? Because it prevents people actually meeting physically. You're not going to be able to really go over to the other side. You can't step over something 5 foot high. And in theory, since it was to stop people mingling, it would even be at its lowest level of kashrus, just about permissible to have that mechitza transparent. He certainly wasn't recommending it, but when you're dealing with with people who say that they're only going to build the minimum mechitza or no mechitza at all, that would be preferable. So that's according to Rav Moshe Feinstein. It doesn't really have to be opaque. It's nice if it were, and it really should be. In any form, sure, it must be. But if pushed to shove, then he was prepared to give a kashrus to a lower level of mechitza, even though it was partly transparent, based upon the fact that it at least prevents Yisarvu elu emelu, the two genders physically mixing, which is the motivation behind the mechitza, in his opinion. Now, the Satmar Rebbe went like this first opinion. The Satmar is always going to be more machmir, as you would understand this. It's more Beis Shammai like. And it says, Kedosh lo yistaklu anoshim, which means that a man must not be able to see a woman, which means it has to be opaque, which also means it has to be much higher. Because if it's lower than if you like, the top of the head, then the man and the women will be able to see each other. So his requirement would be 2 meters probably for a mechitza, and it would either have to be wooden or it would have to have very thick curtains, and thin lattice work wouldn't be allowed either. The idea of a lattice erev, etc., mechitza comes into doubt, according to the Satmar Rebbe, but not according again to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Even it's lattice. The fact is you're not going to be able to climb through the lattice holes unless they're really, really big. So therefore, it is an adequate mechitza. So this was the basis of the machlokas between the Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Satmar Rebbe. And as you can see, ironically, it is based upon the way in which this particular story of the events of the Beis HaMikdash are interpreted. And it has quite serious halachic ramifications. I'm now returning to the Gemara. Having put that aside, let's carry on where the Gemara says, Heichi ovid lehu. So this is, you've lost the place so far. The penultimate line, 1, 2 line, in other words, the line above the bottom line, towards the end, Heichi ofid hochi, and the next line starts v'hoksiv. The Gemara now asks a very interesting question. Okay, we now understand what this particular tikkun was, what they built in the Beis HaMikdash. It was this women's gallery that projected up from high above the Ezrat Noshim. However, Heichi ofid hochi, how could they have done this? And the Gemara is going to suggest that this was an illegal construction. Did they go to the Iriyah and get a building permit to do this? This is essentially what the Gemara is going to ask over here, although put rather more halachically. Heichi ovid lehu. How could they have made an additional projection from the walls of the Beis HaMikdash? V'hoksiv. And we're now going to quote a posuk from Divrei Hayomim, and the Gemara quotes just part of the whole story here. The Gemara now quotes Hakol bichsav miyad Hashem olai iskil. All of it was as specified in writing from the hand of Hashem on me. He helped me understand it. So let me share the psukim with you again. We're going to learn some nach, as we always do. I have to learn some nach. My only way I learn any nach is by preparing for this shiur. So therefore, you give me the opportunity to learn nach with you. And I'm going to take it from a number of psukim earlier up, so we can actually see what the whole context of this posuk is. So you always remember in the Gemara, you often quote words seemingly without any context. So you really have to look them up in situ to see what the story is. So here, it says here, by Yakel David, as Kol Sorei Yisrael, Sorei Shvatim, Sorei Machlekos, Hamishores, and Zamelech, Sorei Olofim, Sorei Ameos. David assembled all the officers of Israel, all the officers, etc., captains, stewards, property, cattle, etc. And what did he do? El Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. This is a great gathering. David HaMelech is going to do something of enormous value, he hopes, for the Jewish people. And he assembles them in Yerushalayim. And by Yikach David HaMelech al Raglov, it says, Yokom, he rose to his feet and he made a speech. And he said, let's just read the English here. Hear me, my brothers, my people. I wanted to build a resting place for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God, and I laid aside material for building. David HaMelech says, I have prepared all the materials for building a Beis HaMikdash. Up to now, the Aron has been lying in a wooden chamber or in a Mishkan or in a tent, and it's essentially not a cover to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm going to build a great edifice for housing the Oren of the Bris Hashem. And this is what I intended to do. And I gathered all the material, and the architects had drawn up all the plans. And then what happened? Last minute, I did not get a Tofes Arba. I did not get the permission to make the building. Then God said to me, you will not build a house for my name, for you are a man of battles and have shed blood. What a letdown. David HaMelech dearly wants to build the Beis HaMikdash, and he's told, you're not the man for the job. You're a great person. You're the greatest king of Israel. But a requirement is that it should be built by a man of peace. The Beis HaMikdash is supposed to be a place that creates, if you like, engenders peace between man and God and between man and man. And okay, you have a very good reason to shed blood. You are fighting the Pelishtim. You were trying to make order in the Medinat Yisrael as it was at that time, and therefore there is no sin in you. However, at the same time, you are a man of blood. That is a reality, and therefore you cannot build the Beis Hamikdash. By Yomeli, and so he said to me, it'll be your son Solomon who will build my house. Shlomo Melech, hu yivneh beisi, he will build my house. He says, Ki bocharti vo. Hashem says, I have chosen him, li leben, to be as a son for me, but ani ehye lo la'av, and I'll be like a father to him. Your son Shlomo will do the job. Thank you for preparing the materials, etc., and the plans, but you can hand them right over to your next generation. So it says, Vayitin David lishlomo knows tablis ulam. Very interesting. David gave Shlomo his son the plan of the ulam. It says of the porch and its houses. Terrible translation here. It means the ulam is this great big building, which is the main building that houses the Aron and the menorah, etc. There's Botov, all its housing, Beginzachov, Al Yosov, all the structures in the Beis Hamikdash. There was an architectural plan. Yes, it was handed over. All the drawings that had been done were handed over to Shlomo from David, and this is the important thing. It says, Hakol bichsav yad miyad Hashem olai. This is the apostle quoted. Hiskil kol malochos hatavnis. All this that the Lord made me understand by his hand on me, I give you in writing the plan of all the works. The blueprint, the architect's drawings are all there. So this explains the background to the Gemara's kasha. The Gemara asked the question, how could they build this structure onto the Beis Hamikdash? The Beis Hamikdash has been pre-planned. Its drawings were handed over from David to Shlomo, and Shlomo would have built according to that exact specification. If you add on bits and pieces, projections, balconies, then you are changing the specification. And since it says here in Divrei Hayomim, Hakol biksav, miyad Hashem olai hiskil, that those drawings were with the approval of Hashem, how was it possible that at a later stage, in order to witness the spectacle of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the Beis HaMikdash builders were allowed to impose additional construction on the edifice of the building. That building was sacrosanct, was supposed to remain as it was. Now, I have to say, this is all a little bit problematic, because we all know that the Beis HaMikdash did expand and did change over time. If you read this, it seems that the Beis HaMikdash, had it not been for this balcony, was destined to remain exactly as it was in the drawings given by David to Shlomo in the 10th century BCE. Well, we had the first Beis Hamikdash lasted for hundreds of years until 586 or whatever, 400 or so years, and it changed even over that time. And then during Bais Sheni, now we're talking about Rishon and Bais Sheni here with the construction, probably talking about the women's gallery built in Bais Sheni times. It started off as a wooden structure, almost very small, and expanded several times until we reached the magnificent structure of Herod. So are you really telling me that there was no change in the Beis HaMikdash since the time of Shlomo Melech. We know jolly well there was. And if we know jolly well there was, what's the Gemara's question over here? How could they build a balcony? They built more than a balcony. They completely changed it. Herod enlarged the whole area. He built the Har HaBayis, he built supporting walls. He increased the area of nearly all the buildings. He built those colonnades. Much of that wasn't there during Bais Rishon. So this is a little bit of a question on the intention of the Gemara. The Gemara would have been well aware of the fact that the Beis HaMikdash evolved. So there are a number of possible answers you can give to say, for example, that maybe, even though it was well known there were many evolutions and improvements to the Beis HaMikdash, all those improvements were intended to allow the Beis HaMikdash to function according to its purpose and its main purpose of karbonos, etc. So where it was needed to enhance the facilities, to make it larger, to change the shaping a little bit in order to facilitate those ceremonies, then that's not a problem, because after all, ultimately the Beis HaMikdash has to serve its function. But over here, this enhancement was to build a women's gallery so that they have a good view of what was going on in the festivities below. Well, the festivities below could have been done without any onlookers in the women's gallery. It could have been done with any women looking at all. So it could be the reason the Gemara is not happy with this construction is that it was a little bit of a discretionary add-on that wasn't necessary to the vital functioning of the Beis HaMikdash. And such a construction for a non-vital function is a violation of this Hakol B'chsav B'yad Hashem Olai skill, that Hashem has already set out the plans, and you're making these little improvements and enhancements over here, these shiputzim, which are entirely unnecessary for the functioning of the Beis HaMikdash. So that could be the reason why the Gemara is up in arms over here. Anyway, so the Gemara now has to answer this question. How could they build this gallery on, given that the Beis HaMikdash structure was meant to be sacrosanct and not change over time? How could they make this additional add-on? So Gemara says, Amar Rav, towards the end of the last line on this Amud, Amar Rav, Kra Ashkachu V'Dorosh. If you like, the management of the Beis HaMikdash, I shouldn't say the management, the rabbinical management of the Beis HaMikdash, they interpreted a pasuk to allow them to make the necessary changes. And what was the pasuk? So over here, you've got to go on to the second sheet. If you've got a second sheet, we'll turn over to Nun Beis Amud Aleph. The softa ha'aretz mishpachos levad, and the land mourned or made hespedim, all the families separately. Mishpachas Beis David levad. I'll just translate and then I'll teach you some Tanakh again if you don't remember this pasuk. The family of the house of David separately, u'nesheihem levad, and their wives separately. So let's just go on with the Gemara's drush, and then we'll see what the context is. It seems that the men were making this hesped on their own, and the women on their own. Now, a hesped is something in which you mourn the loss of something dear, usually someone who's dear to you. You make speeches, about the merits of the person who's passed away. So for one reason or another, which we haven't been told over here, we'll have to turn to the Tanakh, there is a giant hesped going on. And the hesped was separate. Men and women were separated at the hesped. So says the Gemara, well, what do we learn from here? Something very important. Amru, they said, the sages said, V'halo devarim kal v'choma. Is this not a kal v'choma? Is this not an obvious way that we can learn what we have to do in the Simchas Beis HaShoeva from this pasuk? Umar behesped, if already at the time of Umar le'osid lovo she oskin behesped, that the pasuk is referring to a time when the people are busier with a hesped, mourning over the loss of a significant figure, as we will see, Ein Yetzirah Sholet Bohem, and at a time when the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is already weakened. We'll see what that means. Amrot Torah Anoshim Levad noshim lavad, and yet this pasuk says that this state of mourning was entered into, segregated by the genders, the men separately and the women separately. Well, achshav, now when we're dealing with the Simchat Beit HaShoeva and the Beis HaMikdash, asukim besimcha, and the people are merry and rejoicing and drinking their wine and juggling and doing all sorts of dancing in the Beis HaMikdash. The Yetzer Hara sholet behem, and therefore the Yetzer Hara is ravaging through them as they jump around. Alachas kama v'chama. Isn't it obvious that you need to separate the genders? The Gemara is using this as source. You could just say it's common sense. You want to make men and women separate. Says the Gemara, you need to bring a pasuk. This is a pasuk that shows that even in a situation where there's no reason to separate the genders, we're talking about a hesped, and as we'll see in a moment, we're talking about Yemos HaMashiach, when the Yetzer Hara is weakened. We'll see that in a moment. Even then, there was a separation of genders. Doesn't that not teach us that at the time that the Yetzer Hara is more rampant, at a time today, and when people are in a mood of joy and dancing, which is more likely to lead to levity and lightheadedness, isn't it obvious that you need to separate the genders? Having seen this pasuk and interpreted this way, the Sanhedrin, if you like, decided that it was vital to create a structure on the walls of the Beis HaMikdash to build this gallery, despite the pasuk we quoted, that really the structure of the Beis HaMikdash should remain intact and sacrosanct. Nevertheless, when you're dealing with such a serious issue of tzniut at a time of simcha, it was possible to override that and to say that, you know, you have over here a clash of values. You have one value which says keep the Beis HaMikdash intact. That's what the original architectural drawings were, and it should remain as they were. And the second value that says you need to promote tzniut. And over here, you can see from this pasuk that it's something that's very important, even at a time when there isn't a Yetzer Hara, there should be tzniut. Kal v'chomer when there is a Yetzer Hara. So the two values clash, and the rabbis decided that that second value, maintaining distance between the genders, was more important, because without that, the whole ceremony of the Beis HaMikdash is valueless anyway. The Beis HaMikdash is supposed to be a place of spirituality. And if you're going to conduct affairs in the Beis HaMikdash in a way which is going to contradict the spirituality and not in the right spirit, then you might as well not have the Simchas Beis HaShoeva at all. And this was their justification for building the structure of the women's gallery. I'm going to share with you again some more Tanakh, and we'll have a look at this pasuk about mourning. Who were they mourning for? What on earth are we talking about? Now, unfortunately, we are talking about from the book of Zechariah, which is certainly not the easiest book to talk about, and it's a reference to the Yemos HaMashiach. And I've sort of taken a few psukim here. They're not really all consecutive in this chapter, but I've tried to do this from time to time. I'm stingy. I don't want to put too many psukim down, so I contract it a bit so that we can get to see what the overall run of the chapter is. So this is referring to the end of days. A lot of Zechariah refers to the end of days. We don't understand it, but let's try and translate it. Yogain Hashem ba'ad Yosef Yerushalayim. Let's look at the English again. And that day, the Lord will shield the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the feeblest of them shall be in that day like David, and the house of David like a divine being, like an angel of the Lord at their head. It's a beautiful pasuk showing the advancement of humankind, if you like, at the time of the end of days. V'hoya b'yomahu, to be on that day. Let's read the translation. In that day, I will seek but annihilate all the nations that come up against Jerusalem. This is completely crazy. I will seek Lahashmid, to destroy all the nations that come up to Jerusalem. This takes us to the war of Gog and Magog, that somehow nations will battle against Jerusalem. They will come up from surrounding countries and wish to take Jerusalem at the end of days. but they will be stalled. And this battle of Gog and Magog will take place. It could be that Gog and Magog are both foreign powers battling each other on the territory of Eretz Yisrael. Again, what Gog and Magog are, what they represent, is very difficult to say. But that final catastrophic battle will take place. And what will happen then? Beautiful words. I will fill the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem with a spirit of pity and compassion, and they will lament to me about those who are slain, wailing over them as over a favorite son, and showing bitter grief as over a firstborn. Where did this come from all of a sudden? Who are they mourning? V'shafachti al beis David, v'al Yoshev Yerushalayim, ruach chen v'tachnunim, v'hibitu elai. Hibitu elai often means they will look to me. He translates they will lament to me. Eis asher dokaru. Actually, tkar means to stab or to slay, maybe. They will look to me about the one who has been slain, the softu olav, and wail over him. He translates it as wail over them over here, but that's not correct. Olav doesn't say aleihem. There will be a mass mourning ceremony for an individual who has died, and it will be such a hesped as hasn't been seen before. So who is this individual who is being warned? Who is being mourned? By Yomahu, we'll see. And that day, the wailing in Jerusalem shall be as great as the wailing at Hadad Rimon in the plain of Megiddo. Again, you need all the commentaries to try and explain what on earth we're comparing this wailing to. And they say that if you read these places, Hadad Rimon and Megiddo are two separate events, possibly. And Hadad Rimon would be when Achav was killed by the Arameans, and Megiddo was where Yeshayahu, the king Yoshayahu, was slain by the Egyptians in battle. Anyway, so these were two kings of Israel who were slain in battle, and there were great hespedim for them. And at the end of days, there will be an equally great hesped, and it will be for this individual. Who is this individual? As we'll see in a moment, this individual is the legendary, but not very easily understood, Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben Yosef, according to tradition, and it's tradition based partly upon obscure psukim, and also upon Medrash and on Kabbalah, that in the battle, or during the battle of Gog and Magog, which is the final one in which eventually the Jewish people will come out on top and those attacking nations will be destroyed, during that battle, if you like, the first stage Mashiach will arise, and he will be called the Mashiach ben Yosef. He will not be from the house of David, he will be from the house of Ephraim or Yosef or whatever it is. And he will lead the people to success over their enemies. But unfortunately, he will die and become a martyr in the process. And following him, he will have set the stage, if you like, for the next Mashiach, who will really rebuild the Jewish people as a nation. And that will be Mashiach ben David. So we have Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. It's all very difficult, very confusing. Ask Rabbi Breitovitz to explain this to you sometime. Maybe he will. It's Zechariah who really goes